Okay, so let's go ahead and get started because I know everybody has a schedule to adhere to. So today I'm introducing a good friend of mine, Beau Rapier. So I spent my time at Austin Peay in a small office working with this individual on separate projects. Just someone I met, had a good relationship with, and hopefully a lot of you are considering going on to a master's program just because you'll find that is kind of the community that you develop in a master's program is really different even from that you experience in the undergraduate. So if you're at all interested in that side of it, definitely worth considering. So Beau comes to us from Gulf South Research Corporation today, and I don't want to speak to what he does, but what he's previously done is about 9 years worth of field work, all the way from his time as a junior at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where he earned a bachelor's in forestry, wildlife management, and habitat conservation. And at Austin Peay, he finished his master's in biology. And without taking up any more of his time, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Cool. Thanks, Brett. So my name is Beau Rapier. As Brett said, I work at GSRC. I work as a field biologist, doing environmental consulting in the private sector. But before I get on and talk about what I do and some of the stuff that I'm involved with and kind of my background before I got to this position, I just wanted to say thanks for having me come. It's really good to be back on a campus and see you guys. I want to thank Brett, all the faculty and students for having me come and talk to you guys. So I'm really excited to be here. So here's our agenda. I'm just going to do a brief introduction on who I am and my education and some of the jobs I've had leading up to where I'm at right now. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the private sector, what it is and how environmental science fits into that segment. And then I'm also at the end just going to give some examples on a few of the projects I've worked on that I thought were really exciting at my time as a consultant for GSRC. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I have a lot of herp photos, reptiles and amphibians. They're some of my favorite groups to work with, so you'll see a lot of that coming up. That's a Texas horned lizard on top of an ant hill that I found down in Texas. So my path as far as education goes, I started at SIU, Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, as Brett said, doing a forestry wildlife degree, 4-year degree. And in between junior year and senior year, I started to get involved with some seasonal field work. So that was kind of my first actual experiences getting field work and getting paid to do it. So I went to we have a PhD program at our university, and there was a doctoral candidate who was looking at eastern wood rats that had been reintroduced into Southern Illinois. So they were a listed species at the time, and the government did a captive breeding program, started repatriating some of these sites where they historically inhabited. And we were going out there to monitor their success. And some of the populations were doing really well. Some of them were blinking off, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And so I started doing a little independent research project where I would actually go out and collect raccoon feces at the sites where we had reintroduced these eastern wood rats. And the reason we were doing that is the wood rats, they'll cache food, including raccoon feces, eat them later, get the seeds and stuff out of them. And the raccoons have this parasite called the raccoon roundworm. It's this nematode that hangs out inside the digestive tract. Usually doesn't cause them any issues, but what will happen is the wood rats will eat that, and then instead of going to the digestive system of the wood rat, it migrates to the brain and kills them. And so we were looking at going and getting these feces from these different areas and looking at it underneath the microscope to see, is this raccoon roundworm in these certain areas? And so that was my first experience kind of doing some field work. We'd be going out to these different sites way out in the middle of the Shawnee National Forest and capturing wood rats, tagging them, and doing all kinds of stuff with them. And then from there, I started working with the University of Nevada, Reno. So I was still at Southern, but in between my senior year and my master's, I went out and got hooked up with some people that do some small mammal research out in Nevada. And some of the projects I work on out there, their lab was really cool. They did some population genetics of pygmy rabbits, smallest rabbit in the United States, one of the 2 rabbit species that actually burrow and make its own burrow systems. And then we also did some really cool research where definitely hands down the best field experiences I had, where we would go out for multiple weeks at a time out in the middle of these places where people had done these historic mammal collections, like E. Raymond Hall, these people in the early 1900s taking horses up to these places to go sample the communities. And so we went back and we're doing the exact same thing. And the questions that we were focused on looking were how are these populations, these animal populations that are on these sky islands, these mountains that are just isolated by desert all around them, how is climate change impacting where these animal species occur elevationally on the mountains? Because our thought was things are going to keep moving up to those cooler areas to counteract the effects of the climate change overall. And so that was an awesome experience where I got to go out there for multiple weeks with a small group of people and went trapping. And at that point, the person who was leading that field experience was a postdoc. And he, while I was out there, got hired at Austin Peay. And so then I went to Austin Peay to get my master's and worked with that postdoc who is now a fresh advisor over there at APSU. And I continued answering some of those questions and looking at some of those things that we had looked at UNR and at Southern. And there's you guys have probably heard of it, Catoosa Wildlife Management Area up in the Cumberland Plateau, northeast of here. I worked out at Catoosa, and they had a really bad pine beetle bark outbreak, which deforested a bunch of their pine stands. And so what they ended up doing is they did a bunch of salvage cuts and a lot of prescribed burning because those trees, those shortleaf pine respond really well to the burning. So what I was looking at is going out and trapping mammals and all these different habitat prescriptions. Some where they didn't burn at all, some where they burned, some where they burned them thin, and looking at how these forest management practices impacted the mammal communities and then also the parasites found on those mammals. And so I continued doing a little bit of research. And while I was at Austin Peay, I also got involved with my first private consulting firm. My advisor, he had experiences working with this consulting firm. And so I got to go out and volunteer with them doing some bat research, and eventually got hired on for some seasonal work doing bird point count studies out in the Appalachian Mountains. And then, of course, I met Brett at APSU. Brett's lucky because my Facebook got hacked and I had a bunch of embarrassing pictures of him and us in the lab, but now they're no more. So he's from this one forever. And then shortly after I got it at APSU, I took a job at Gulf South Research Corporation. It's a private company doing environmental consulting. Talk a little bit about what they do. But first, I'll just go through a little bit about my job. So I've worked at GSRC for 4 years. So it hasn't been long since I was in your guys' shoes, coming to seminars and going to school. I primarily work doing biological resources surveys, doing flora and fauna surveys, threatened endangered species, water quality, soil quality. I also work doing a lot of NEPA documentation. So does anybody know what NEPA stands for? Anybody taking any environmental policy?
National Environment Protection Act.
Really close. Policy. Yeah. I should know that. National Environmental Protection. Yeah, I think you're correct. Sorry about that. And so basically what that is it's this federal law that was enacted in 1969. And it's basically just holding the government accountable for their actions and taking into consideration the environment and taking a stewardship responsibility for the lands and stuff that they manage. So where I work is a small little company. Here's on our website what we say. We're a fast-growing woman-owned business offering a variety of environmental services. And what's interesting about the way the consulting field works is there's a bunch of different types of companies that are in this field. Some of them are woman-owned businesses, some of are veteran-owned, disabled-owned. There's all these different segments, and there's pools of contracts depending on what your angle is. So we have a whole group of contracts that are earmarked for certified women-owned businesses that we'll pull from to get contracts. And since we're only about 35 individuals, we just can't compete with some of the international companies that have thousands of employees. In addition to the NEPA and the natural resources, we also do quite a bit of cultural resources stuff. So we have a whole archaeology division as well. So here's my office. That's actually my office right there. I took a quick little snap of it before I came out for this presentation. This is our main headquarters in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We also have three other offices. We have a small satellite office in San Diego, one in Tucson, and one in Niceville, Florida. Most of those offices only have a few individuals working at them. Out at Baton Rouge, we have about 25 staff, including support. So this is also my office quite a bit. This is me wading into gator-infested water to set out a trap for rainbow snakes. So my responsibilities at this job are coordinating with clients, conducting surveys, going out in the field, gathering data, and then reporting my findings and just going out and finding new work. That's kind of the cycle of how we're looking for things. And before we go out and conduct the surveys, there is a pretty critical step there in between 1 and 2, where we do some desktop analysis, we call it, where if I'm going to go somewhere that I'm not familiar with, like Arkansas or somewhere to go do a survey, I'll go and do a bunch of research before I go there, so I have an idea of what I'm kind of getting into. And we were talked about with a few students here last night. There's a bunch of tools I'll use. Some of you guys have probably heard of iNaturalist. That's a great one. I'll go on there all the time. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be in this county, sort by most likely found things, and then I can get an idea like, okay, these 20 species of plant are found all the time, and then I'm like going in with a good knowledge of what I'm getting into before I even get out there. And so those are main responsibilities and kind of the flow of things. Some of the clients that we work with, we get a lot of federal contracts. So DoD is a huge one, Department of Defense. So we go and work on pretty much any military installation you can think of, whether it's Army, Air Force, go on all these different bases, have to get all these different clearances to go on to these different places. We also work directly with the Army Corps. So USACE, United States Army Corps of Engineers. We also work with Fish and Wildlife Service and Forest Service. Those entities will also have contracts that they'll come out with for consultants like us to bid on. And we also do stuff with the state government. Really popular places for us or avenues that we get state government work is through Department of Transportation, any type of utilities or right-of-ways where they're going to be clearing areas. We'll go out there beforehand and assess the situation. Gopher tortoise are a really big thing down there, especially in the right-of-ways. So mitigating for those and moving them around if we need to, trapping and relocating, doing different things, just depending on what the project requires. And we also work with private organizations and private citizens on a small scale. It's like real estate developers or even just individual landowners that are wanting to develop their land. We'll go out there and help them and keep them in compliance with government regulations and make sure that they're not going to get in a lot of trouble and help them get through the red tape. And typically what we act as in the federal government or like Department of Defense, we have an Army contract or something like that. We're usually a conduit between that person who's our client, the military, and then Fish and Wildlife Service. And so when we're dealing with our endangered species, I'm kind of like the conduit communicating with the Fish and Wildlife Service, like, hey, we found this pineapple cactus on this land. And then we work out a strategy to figure out how to continue the project or not continue the project, or how to mitigate for those cactus that we see on the land. And that mitigation could be anywhere from transplanting them and moving them to a different spot, taking them to a plant nursery to get seeds that we can then propagate more cactus and release those in the landscape, or put those cactus in a set-aside mitigation bank that the Fish and Wildlife Service maintains in perpetuity for those species concerned. So typical jobs that I do: general flora fauna surveys, certain endangered species surveys, lots of wetland delineations and permitting, and NEPA report preparation and coordination, and then some other random odd jobs. So I'm going to go through and just talk about each one of those a little bit individually. And then these are 2 listed species that I've found while I've been out in the field. That top one is the interior population segment of least tern. That's a little chick. And then this is a northern cat-eyed snake, which is state threatened in Texas. It only comes up right along the border of South Texas. All right. So the flora and fauna surveys, I kind of think of them as like these bio blitzes. Usually they're just these explorative studies where we'll go to an installation and they just want to know what is on their property just to get a baseline of what's there. So we'll go out there with multiple people, usually separate into groups of 2 or 3. We'll have a couple teams and we'll just go into different habitats and just basically just document every plant, animal, fungus that we can find. And in addition to that, sometimes there'll be specific creatures that their range goes there. Like the dismal swamp shrew is an example I can think of off the top of my head. There's this shrew species that occurs in Virginia that the range should be in that installation. And so we employ some specific methodology in order to try to detect that species. So we'll set out small mammal traps, herp traps, light traps for insects a lot, which is really interesting, setting up white sheets at night, making these bug collection light stations. And then from there, we're also looking to identify sensitive resources, whether those be individual animals or habitats that we find that are like, hey, this is a really cool glade or kind of like a critically imperiled habitat that we don't see in a lot of other areas, but you guys have some of that here. So kind of make that a conservation priority on your land. And so what we end up doing after we go through these surveys is then we have a lot of GIS mapping that we end up doing. We have a team of 2 or 3 ladies at GSRC who do our GIS mapping, and they're great about taking our data that we collect on our Trimble GPSs, and they make all these beautiful maps showing the different habitat segments and where the listed species are that we found, things like that. And we go ahead and make a report showing all these findings, and we give it to the client, and then they use it for future planning and for future projects. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the wetland delineations. These are typically for private clients. We don't usually do these a lot with the government. And the wetland delineations are pretty cool. So it's governed by the Army Corps of Engineers. They're who we're working with. And what we do is if there's a project where a real estate person is trying to put in some type of development, and they have a few different areas that they have that they think they might want to build houses on, or whatever it is, the gas station, we'll go out to those areas and assess how much wetland is on those properties, and also look for sensitive resources and try to help them figure out the best option from a red tape setting to where they're not having to mitigate for a bunch of wetland or destroy a bunch of wetland. We're trying to conserve as much as we can on the front end before we go and start developing. So the way we assess how much wetland is on a property is we do these sample points, sample plots that we take. And this all comes out of the 1987 Corps manual on how to do this. It's a standardized methodology used across the country. There's different regions. So they're treated slightly different depending on if you're Texas versus Tennessee. There'll be different indicators that you're looking for that will tell you if this is a wetland or an upland, depending on where you're at. But the 3 major things that we're looking at when we go to a sample point and we're trying to assess if this is a wetland is we look at the soil, we look at the hydrology, and we look at the vegetation. So we take a soil core, which you can kind of see up there, take a soil core 16 inches down, and then we use this book. It's called a Munsell book, and it has all these little paint chips. And basically what you're looking for a lot of times in the soil is redox or oxidization in the soil. So if there's a lot of water sitting in the soil over a long time, the iron in the soil will start to rust, and you'll actually get these orange mottles that show up in the soil. So if you see that, then you know that even if the water isn't sitting on the land right at that time, that redox will stay in the soil for a really long time and persist. And so we'll look at the soil, and we have to have all 3 of these checked off before it's a wetland. So we'll have to look at some indicators for soil. Then we'll look at hydrology, and that's just, is there water a lot of times? If there's standing water or a water table, that's usually a pretty good indicator that this is a hydrologically active area. But we can also look at things such as like crayfish burrows, or if there's amphibians or anything like that. Those things can be indicators for whether or not hydrology is present on the landscape as well. And then the next thing that we look at is the vegetation that's present in that area. So every single plant that you can think of has an indicator status. So it's either an obligate wetland plant, where it's only found in wetlands 100% of the time, or it's a facultative wetland plant, facultative upland, or upland. And so the upland plants are only found in the most xeric dry areas. Obligates are found, like cattails is an example of an obligate species. You only see those growing right on the edge of the water or growing out of the water. And so then what we're looking at is we take all the plants that we're seeing in that area, and then we take their relative cover to each other, and then see, is there a higher proportion of hydrophytic plants that fall on that wetland side of the spectrum, or is there a higher proportion of upland plants that fall on like the more dry side? And so you have to have your soil indicators, you have to have indicators of hydrology, and you have to have a predominance of hydrophytic vegetation. All 3 of those things need to be present, and then you have a wetland. So then what we would do is I would typically do a wetland point kind of right about here on the edge of this bank to categorize this little wetland community. And then what I would do is take a step into that forest where it goes up in elevation. And then I do the exact same thing. I take another point, and my soil might be there. My hydrology, I'm probably not going to have any water up on that hill or any indicators of water present on that area. And the vegetation, I'm starting to get more pine, probably some more facultative and upland plants. So then I have 2 points on my GPS showing this is wet and I have data attached to this point. This is dry, I have data attached to that point. And then we take a polygon line on our GPS and draw in the wetland. And then that area is considered a wetland based on what we've looked at. And then what we do is we write up a little report describing all the sample plots with maps showing where the wetlands are, and then we submit that to the Army Corps. We say, hey, we went out and we looked at this land, and this is what we think is wet, this is what we think is dry. And then a lot of times they'll agree with us, but usually what ends up happening is kind of been different with COVID recently, but typically what ends up happening is they come out and meet me in the field at a later date, and they want to like look over things and check it all out and make sure that it jives with what they're thinking. Then at that point, they give us a jurisdictional determination, and it's a 5-year document that is an agreement that's saying, yes, this is the dry, this is the wet. And if you build into the wetland, you're going to have to pay up and pay mitigation. And the reason for that is the Clean Water Act. Part of that states that there will be no net loss of wetland. So if we're going to take out wetland from productivity, we have to maintain or produce a wetland of similar size or quality in the same watershed. And so we help deal with the permitting process and the mitigation and helping people develop their projects while also trying to eliminate as much harm to the environment as possible. And so then getting into the NEPA, this is kind of like the flow of how these NEPA documents usually work out. So NEPA is looking at, first you're looking at the purpose and need. So down here, what is the project? What is the purpose of the project? And it can be anything from building a parking lot to building a radio tower, a gas station, anything like that. What is the purpose and what is the need for the project? At that point, we meet the client and go over the DAPA, which is the description of the proposed action. So basically, we get on the same page to determine what's the project, what do you need done. Then at that point, we go to the affected environment and constraints. So then we go through and assess a whole slew of environmental resources. So WOTS, that's waters of the US, so that's wetland resources and navigational waters like rivers. We'll go and do general flora fauna surveys. We'll do T&E surveys to make sure there's no threatened and endangered species on these properties. We'll do cultural and historical surveys in that area. We have people who go and dig pits and shake out whatever they dig, shake out and look for artifacts. And if they find those, then those can be mitigated for or claimed by natives. And then we also do phase 1 hazardous waste assessments, which is we'll go on a property, and if our client is looking to purchase a piece of property, we'll go in there beforehand and make sure that there's not a bunch of electrical transformers on the ground or like leaking oil or anything that once they acquire the property that they could be a liability for. If that oil tank or something that they bought on the property that they didn't know about starts leaking into the groundwater or gets into a water system and somebody finds out, they're going to be on the hook for having bought that property, even though those issues might have been there before they even purchased the property. So we go in and help them with that, make sure that they're not going to run into anything that will be tricky for them later. So we look at the affected environment and the constraints. So what is this project going to do to the environment as it relates to water, animals, people, and previous culture? Then we look at all the different alternatives. When you go through and do this NEPA process, you always have to have multiple alternatives that you're weighing the cost and benefit of each one. So we'll look at the different alternatives and through the scope of all these different surveys. So we go to multiple sites, usually 2 or 3 different sites, and do all these surveys. And then we can kind of compare and contrast the resources on those lands and kind of come to this conclusion where we're balancing the sustainability of the environment, but also getting the project done with the client. So at that point, we do scoping. After we've gone out and looked at the alternatives, we know what the project is, we know what the natural resources are like on that property, then we do scoping, which is basically sending out the description of the proposed action with all the alternatives, kind of like a one sheet describing the project. And we just blast that out to anybody who would be interested in the project feasibly. So the local government, we send it to Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA, any Native American tribes that are in that area or could have jurisdiction over some of those resources, the Army Corps. It's usually 30 or 40 people. And we send this out, let them know that this environmental analysis is coming. And then at that point, we draft our big EA, which is that document up there. That's a draft one that I've done recently. They're usually pretty dense because we have to synthesize all these different resources and go through all that and compare and contrast the different effects of the project on those resources. So we draft this thing called an EA, it's that big document. It's an environmental assessment. And then we send that draft EA out to all the people that we sent the initial scoping letters to. And we say, hey, look, here's the full-blown document showing all the effects and what we're expecting as a result of this project. And then the public has 30 days to send us comments in, and we address all those comments, and then we come out with a final environmental analysis. And then at that point, Depending on the project implications, there could be mitigation that needs to be paid, depending on if there's any resources that are going to be potentially affected. But usually we try to find an alternative that isn't going to be harming any sensitive resources. It's usually the goal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the private sector fits in, just kind of continuing a little bit of some of the jobs that we do. So a lot of what we do is exercising policy. So we have NEPA, we have the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Those are all a lot of things that when I was in school and took environmental policy, I was kind of usually sleeping a little bit in the back, not super interested in that stuff, but it's something I use a lot now. And it's something that I definitely recommend getting a decent knowledge of. We do some soil and water contamination assessments. So I had a project recently in Arkansas. It's a place where they have all these munition bunkers where they store all kinds of chemicals and munitions and ordnance and things like that. And they wanted to do a study of all their different surface waters to make sure that none of the chemicals and things that they had in these bunkers were leaching into the groundwater and potentially able to show up. So we took it's called a YSI, Yellow Springs instrument, I think they're called. And it's basically this cool little device with a probe, and you can stick in the water and it tells you all kinds of different water quality parameters, dissolved oxygen, temperature, turbidity, all these different things. So we went around to all these different surface water sources on the base and assessed their quality. We also do environmental monitoring is a really popular thing. So this is a picture I took just a couple weeks ago down in Grand Isle, Louisiana. Has anybody ever heard of Grand Isle? No. It's a really, really small barrier island as far south in Louisiana as you can get. And might not come as any surprise to you guys, but the hurricanes level that area pretty good. So they have this big dune system, this spore dune that runs the length of the barrier island. And when Ida came through 2 years ago, it completely took that whole dune and pushed all that sand into the little town. And so now they have a project where they're rebuilding that dune and planting it with native vegetation. And so while the construction workers are out there doing that, we were hired as an environmental consultant to come monitor the project. So we were out there construction monitoring, which is basically just holding the construction guys accountable for what they're doing, not throwing cigarette butts on the ground, putting drip pans underneath all their heavy equipment, making sure they have spill kits in case anything leaks, they can quickly take care of it. And so we go down there and kind of keep them in compliance with just general good practices environmentally. And there's critical habitat down there for two shorebirds, the piping plover and the red knot. Both of those occur right there. And so when critical habitat gets involved, that's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service term. Fish and Wildlife Service for certain threatened and endangered species. They've identified these areas that they call critical habitat, which are essential for the survival of that species, essentially. And so there's critical habitat right down there. And so if you want to do any type of development or any mechanized equipment usage inside a critical habitat area, there's a lot of emphasis on it and a lot of attention. And so that's part of the reason why we got involved with this project, so we can help them make sure that they're not disturbing any shorebirds and also not polluting the environment while they're doing the project. So we also do archaeological surveys, as I mentioned before. I haven't gotten too involved in that, but it is really interesting going out. Sometimes I get to go up with some of the archaeology crew, and seeing some of the stuff that they dig up is really cool. They have a really good time. We do environmental compliance audits, and we do environmental planning as well. Just going out, assessing the site and helping people determine some areas that if you need to do a project, these are optimal or suboptimal. We also have out in California, we have a plant nursery. We do a lot of milkweed planting out there. So we'll grow up a bunch of milkweed for monarch butterflies. And then there's a bunch of jobs that are coming out right now for just supplying milkweed to different organizations so that they can go and plant it. And so we've been doing a lot of that recently, and also doing some other really cool rare plant stuff that we've been propagating out there in California, and going to these different project sites and planting in some of these more native species so that the invasive stuff doesn't pop up. So the typical workflow: initial assessment of the job, we go and do a site investigation, then we do remediation or restoration, and then usually monitoring and reporting. some of the benefits to environmental consulting is minimizing environmental risk, reducing liability. So that kind of comes back into that phase one I was talking about, the oil barrels or the transformers on the property. Before our client wants to go buy land, if they're looking at multiple spots, we might tell them to stay away from this place because it's leaching something potentially toxic, or we're going to have to deal with some remediation in the future. Increasing sustainability through planning by going out and knowing what's on the landscape, taking the baseline of what occurs at the installations. They can then use that information to plan for future projects, and then helping them stay, them being clients, in regulatory compliance. So all these different organizations, EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, USACE, they all have different rules and regulations. And so we're kind of a one-stop shop where we can keep people in line with all these different organizations while they're going through their projects. All right, I'm going to get into some fun stuff. These are just a couple. I'm going to go through just a few projects that I've worked on that I thought were really fun in the past. So first one I'm going to talk about is the interior lease term. So they're really cool. A lot of them breed on the Gulf Coast, but there's a population called the interior lease tern, which is slightly different. And they come up these freshwater river systems and find these sandbars, and they put their nests on sandbars. And they time it really perfectly. It's amazing. They come up right when the sandbars are cut off and isolated, and they make these little islands. The water comes up high enough, and the sandbar's isolated. And that's when they'll go and put their nest in, because then predators can't get to them near as easily. And so the survey, we've been doing it for the last 20 years. It actually, the contract isn't around anymore as of last year because the species actually just got delisted. So what we would do is we would take 4 weeks out surveying, separated by 2 weeks each. And so the first week we'd go down, we'd go in this airboat. We hired this guy on an airboat, and we would go down 320 some miles of the Red River through Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And we'd be on this airboat cruising along, and we would just be counting the number of individuals that we saw, the adults. And usually the first trip, it's the adults showing up to the breeding ground. So we're seeing a lot of males, a lot of females. They have this really cool behavior where the male will catch a fish and bring it to the female and offer it to her. And it's kind of like their little mating ritual. Sometimes they get rejected. It's kind of funny to see it, but it's cute to see them go catch the fish. And they'll be doting, chasing around the female, trying to get her to take it. So we count how many individuals are there. And then 2 weeks later, we come back. And then at that point, we get on start seeing these sandbars, and you'll see the nests are really hard to see. They're just these little shallow depressions, and the eggs blend in perfectly. And we'll go and usually observe the sandbar from a distance, and you can see where the adults are coming and landing, and that's where the nests are. So you usually kind of hang out and be like, all right, there's 2 over here, 3 over here. And then you go very tiptoe across the beach because you're always afraid that you're going to step on one or step on an egg because they blend in so well. We'll go over there, see how many nests they are, GPS them, document eggs, document any predation, any animal tracks that we see on the islands. And then we come back 2 weeks later, and we start seeing a lot of little chicks like you saw in that one picture. And their defense mechanism is just lay down and try to blend in as good as they can. So you just walk up to them, and they're just kind of hanging out. And we'll count how many of those we see. And we come back later, and we start to see them fledged out, where they have kind of goofy little feathers, and they're all awkward flying around. And then the last trip we come, they're usually starting to take off. And so it's a really cool trip. Have a lot of history, a lot of crazy things that have happened on the airboats. Just a lot of fun. And so this project was funded through the Army Corps. They have a big dam up at the top of the Red River where we start the project. And the whole idea behind this project is coordinating with the Corps based on what we're seeing with the sandbar and the water level and the nesting, and helping them time how much water to release and when they release it, so that if they were to just release a huge pulse of water when all of these birds are nesting, it'll just wipe out everything and flood all the sandbars. So we're working very closely with them when we're doing this project to make sure that the amount of water that they're releasing and when they're releasing it is not going to be impacting this listed species. Another really cool project I got to work on recently was in Cuba. I went to Guantanamo Bay and worked on a project there. It was a herpetofauna inventory, so reptiles and amphibians. We were specifically trying to find the Cuban boa, which is a listed species that really only occurs right there on Guantanamo Bay. You can find it outside of that area, but the highest population seems to be right there And so we were helping them determine the areas where the boas are at the most and assessing areas where they seem to be crossing the roads the most and putting up signs and doing different things with the speed limits and stuff like that to try to prevent road mortalities of this species. Part of it was just a general herp study. So what we have going on up here was this really cool method that we've started using in a lot of places for documenting herps. Has anybody ever heard of a drift fence for herps? No? Drift fence. So basically all it is just this plywood that we've set up. This long plywood goes out about 50 feet and we bury it shallow in the ground so nothing can really get underneath it. And then historically what people do, herpetologists, they would take 5-gallon buckets and they would just bury them flush with the ground. And then the idea was a snake or a frog or even a mammal would come walking along, hit that board, and then go left or right and follow that board. And at that point, they fall in the bucket. You come and check it the next day and see if there's any critters in there. And that's a really cool method. It's been used for a really long time and it's still used today. But it takes a lot of effort and people power to be able to go out there and check those every day. There's also the issues with mortality. Skunks and things have started to learn that those buckets are basically free buffets. And so you might have issues where animals kind of learn that they can go there and get free food. So there's this new method that we've been implementing. It's called adapted drift fence. And what we do instead is we use trail cameras to document the species. So we have our board running through right here. At the end of the board, we have a 5-gallon bucket that's upside down. And then we have a kind of a Tom and Jerry mouse hole cut out at the bottom of the bucket. And so when things are coming on either side of this, they hit those little flashers, those little wood pieces that stick out, go through that entrance. And then there's a trail camera that's mounted onto the top of that plexiglass facing down. And it grabs pictures of whatever comes through there. And then we have another hole cut out on the back of the bucket and they just carry on their way. So nothing is technically being trapped. And it's just a passive way to monitor. You don't have to have somebody go out there every single day. Somebody can come out once a month and check the card and see what's there. So we set up a bunch of those. We set up some song meter devices, which I'll get into those, these acoustic recorders. And we also just did general pedestrian surveys, going out at night, going out in the morning, headlamps, and just trying to find stuff that way. So here's some pictures of the drift fences. The goal with this was to put them in a bunch of different habitats to try to determine what the assemblages of reptiles and amphibians were like in these individual spots. Also see if the boas were preferring any areas over the other. So these are all places from Cuba, a few different habitats that we trapped. And you can see kind of the length of the boards here. I'm going to show you guys some pictures that we got from these so far. So this is a big old cane toad. Came in. Those are kind of an issue down there. Quite a few cane toads are invasive. We've got, this is really cool. These are these dwarf boas. They're only about this big. They're really cool. Little tiny dwarf boas. There's a few different species that you can find in Cuba. And interestingly enough, they do a thing that some lizards will do, where if you pick them up or if they get harassed or anything, they'll start bleeding out of their eyes. And it's really creepy when you start seeing them just like dripping blood out of your eyes. Like, ooh, a little alarming. Got blue-tailed amoebias. These little guys that run all over the place. Some curly-tailed lizards. There's 3 different species of curly-tailed lizard that we were able to find there. It's the Monte Verde curly lizard, Eocephalus. These are really cool. This is probably the most common snake that we'd see in Guantanamo Bay. It's a racer. You guys have those around here, but it's like a Cuban variety, Cuban racer. Pretty sassy little guys. And we also get other stuff too. This is the Cuban grass quit, cool little finchy bird that they have down there. We would get invasive rats all the time. And these big giant blue land crabs will always get in our traps. Got about 1 million pictures of them. And then while we were in Cuba, we put up these things called song meters. So it's basically like, if you know what a trail camera is, it's basically like that, but for audio. And so we programmed this device to turn on, it was an hour in the morning, then an hour at night, right at sunset and right at sunrise. So what we're trying to do is get frogs on there. A lot of the frog species that are out there respond really strongly to the seasonal rains. And so if you're not out there when it's raining, they're underground, not doing their thing. So we put out devices like this that can just passively monitor for us throughout the year. You just need to have somebody go in there and check the SD card, change the batteries every once in a while. then it comes through with these really high quality audio that you can go through and analyze and listen to later. I found a bunch of frog species that way that we wouldn't have found otherwise. So we just usually find some water bodies, some permanent water, and put to a tree just like you would with a choke hammer, and they have these little microphones that stick out. So we would also just do some general surveys. A lot of these are at night, doing some road cruising. So just driving the gravel roads and just looking to see what we can find. So on the top left, that's a spherodactylid gecko, Rubel's least gecko, and that's full size. They're just itty bitty, but they're bright colors and really, really cool. This is a species of nightingale. That was the only one we found after 4 weeks of searching. We found it on the very last night, and it was like one of the few species that could occur there that we hadn't found yet. So we were really, really excited to find that. This is the Cuban boa, the listed species. They can get up to 8 feet, 9 feet. They can get pretty hefty. This is a peltrophine toad. They're really neat, bright green. Only saw those on the road a couple times. They have a population of iguanas up there, Cuban iguanas. They're kind of like the unofficial Guantanamo Bay mascot. Like people will be picnicking out by the beach and they'll kind of come up and try to get some food. There's a bunch of infamous ones that are named that have, will kind of basically chase you down and try to get your food. So they can be a little aggressive, and the natural resources manager that works there full time, he's constantly responding to iguana calls and having to go out with like a big, looks like the thing that you would restrain a dog with or something, and like grab them and move them around. And this is really cool. Does anybody know what that is? It's not a worm. If I hear somebody whispering over here.
Saucerian?
Very close. It's like the reptilian version of that. So this is a legless lizard in the group Amphisbaenia. They have these really kind of crazy sharp teeth, actually. But the last time they had found one of those was 30 years ago on Guantanamo Bay. So that was one of our big species that we were hoping to see, but knew we probably wouldn't see. They're phosphorial, spend a ton of time underground, and we were really fortunate to uncover that. And it was like a really big, exciting moment. We were really, really pumped to find that. Some more pictures of some herps that we saw there, Cuban green anole. And then we got another spherodactylid species down here, Torii. They're super cool, little tiny guys. A little racerlet. And then this looks like the house geckos that you guys probably see on the lamps and stuff like that sometimes. But this is actually a native species, Crombie's wall gecko. And they occur down there naturally. And they don't really hang out very much along the lights. They're usually underneath bark on bigger trees out in the brush. And then this is the Cuban tree frog. It's another infamous species that has taken over the southeast United States. Surprisingly, that was one of a few that we found. They are not super densely populated there like they are over here. All right, now I'm going to talk about another project that is dear to my heart. We did a spotted turtle home range study last year up in Virginia. So our contract was to go out to 3 different bases in Virginia, all within about 20 miles of each other, and go out and set traps and try to capture spotted turtles and do a radio telemetry home range study with them. So our goal was to capture 10 turtles. But they're really seasonal on when they occur. And so we were nervous we weren't going to be able to catch them, but we got lucky and hit it at the right time and ended up catching a bunch of them. So, little video there. So at first we went out, assessed the habitat, looked to see where the water is. We're looking for areas that are pretty marshy like this. Open, marshy areas with a lot of dense vegetation and water about 1 to 2 feet. So we set out these are just collapsible mesh minnow traps, and we bait those with sardines and put those out and put a little water bottle in there too to make sure that if it rains that the trap stays above water so they have an area to come up and get some water. And we check the traps twice a day, GPS the traps, and put flagging over the top of them so we can find them. Then we captured the turtles, which was super exciting. We trapped for a whole week, didn't catch a single one, and then all of a sudden started catching 2 at a time, male and a female in each trap. It was really, really exciting. And so we had these little transmitters, radio transmitters. They last about 200 days. We put those on there. We would notch the turtles with a unique spot on an individual scoop so that when we recaptured them, we knew exactly which one that we were looking at. If the transmitter came off, then we could still identify them this way. This is a male and a female, the first two that we caught. Super excited to get those. And then that's a female over there. They've got the orange jaw, where the males have a black jaw. So we would catch them, mark them, measure them, weigh them, put the transmitter on them, and then we would go out and do telemetry. So we would go out and try to find the turtles a few times a week and locate them and take a GPS point of wherever we found them. This was kind of a funny situation where we were really close to one of our turtles, and then we saw this giant erythrogaster, this Nerodia erythrogaster, take off from a bush and have this huge nail in it. And we're like, oh no, one of our turtles is in the snake. So this is showing us comically try to see if one of our transmitters is inside the snake. And luckily it wasn't. So, and then we produce these cool maps just showing only of the 3 bases. We caught them at 2 places. Each one of these colored segments shows an individual turtle, the individual data points, and just a minimum convex polygon showing where they're at. And this was a really cool situation here where we saw there was some water out in this area that was drying up, and a lot of the turtles were coming into this forested area and estivating in this little wood strip over here. And so the Navy was initially thinking of developing this strip of land right here. And now after we've shown them like, hey, your spotted turtles are actually using this spot and it's pretty important for their development and survival, they're probably going to end up taking that into consideration and not developing that area. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It was great to be here. Really enjoyed speaking with you guys. Yeah, my name is Beau Rapier. You can reach me at this email. This is our website. We're hiring field biologists and student biologists. So if anything like this sounds interesting to you, definitely come reach out to me. Appreciate it.
Does anyone have questions for Beau?
Yes.
Do you use regression in your job? And if so, what does it look like?
Do we use regression? In what sense? Like statistically?
Data modeling statistics.
So I got to use a little bit for this. I was doing like a MCP, just minimum convex polygon, which I was using. I'm trying to remember what package I was using in R. But I get to use R a little bit, but not near as much as I used to. Unfortunately, a lot of our projects are go out, collect the data, get an idea of what's going on, and then move on. So we're not really like collecting enough data a lot of times to be able to answer some really big questions. Just like this telemetry study, I think we only have about 20 coins for each turtle. So it's like, it's a start, but it's not a lot big enough data set to really even analyze a lot statistically. Good question.
I have a question. Yeah. Is there any like long-term maintenance, like after you suggest like your strategies of like monitoring that?
Yeah, so I've only been doing this for 4 years, so I don't have a lot of experience seeing how a lot of this like pans out necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But I know a lot of our recommendations with the lease term were taken in really high consideration. I know the natural resources manager at this base was very interested about where the turtles were at, because at this point they knew that they were on their base, but they didn't really have a good idea of where they were at or the habitats that they were using. So I would like to think that this will be continued down the future. They're still going out there and telemetering the turtles and building up on additional data points. And so each one of these bases usually has a natural resource manager that works there, but they're just usually overburdened with stuff to do. And that's why we kind of get contracted out. They identify the projects and we usually come in and work with them to help them out. The natural resource manager here does a really good job of continuing up with the environment and following these projects out. So I'm really hopeful to see how it all pans out in the future.
What exactly does it mean to be part of a woman-owned business?
Yeah, so pretty much all that means from the definition is that the owner of the company owns over 50% of the business. So our boss, Suna, she owns over 50% of the business, and she's our president. She makes all the decisions pretty much. And it's analogous to like a disabled-owned business or a veteran-owned business or minority-owned business. It's just kind of one of those different segments. And so that gives us an opportunity to find contracts that are earmarked specifically for woman-owned businesses. Us being such a small company, if we had to compete with some of these huge international consulting companies, we would get outbid every time. We never have an opportunity to get a job. And we pride ourselves in being really personal with our clients because we do have that kind of like family, small atmosphere. And so that's pretty much what it means to be the woman-owned small business. She owns a majority of the business, makes a lot of the decisions, and that gets us a conduit for certain contracts that put us in small application
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. How important was your PhD for just like general knowledge and maybe like data collection and stuff? And then how important was that for like the application process and getting hired?
Yeah. So our company hires, that's a good question. Our company hires a lot of people that come out with just bachelor's degrees. So we have lots of people that have bachelor's degrees. I'd say that's a majority. A few people with master's, thesis track and non-thesis track. And then we have a couple PhDs. Master's was just really important for just learning how to deal with data, answer questions, and really think things through and really drill down to something really specific and just learn how to become an expert in one individual thing. Where I felt like undergrad was kind of a more general approach to just what you might see. But that was just my experience. I'm sure it's definitely different depending on what you decide to go study. Definitely learned a lot about statistics in my master's for sure, even though I don't get to use that quite as much as I'd like sometimes. Anybody else? Yeah. So I was hopeful that they would because I did the thesis track and I felt like it was a lot of work. But then once I entered the workforce, we hire a lot of people that are non-thesis track. So that's something that Brett and I kind of wrestled with at our time at APSU because they had just, while we were in school, they started that non-thesis track and there was kind of a lot of debate on whether or not we should have that or not. But we seem to just kind of hire people based on once we get a person in front of us, how well they seem like they fit in with the group and how just motivated they are is like a big thing. Like willing to travel is a huge thing. Just being willing to travel and want to travel and go work on different projects is hugely beneficial. So yeah, I would say you definitely don't need thesis track to do what I do. But I definitely feel like I developed a lot of critical work skills through doing my thesis. Anybody else?
Do you have any other questions?
I'll stick around a little bit longer if anybody wants to come up and talk or has any other questions too.
All right, well, let's give our speaker another round.